Revolution begins. Massachusetts defies Britain. Despite the tragedy of the Boston Massacre, the British decision to repeal the Townshend Acts had appeared to end another crisis in colonial relations. Then, in the spring of 1772, Britain introduced several policies that again ignited the flames of rebellion in the colonies. This time, the fire could not be put out. The Gaspee Affair. After Britain repealed the Townshend Acts, trade with the American colonies resumed, and so did smuggling. To intercept the smugglers, the British sent customs ships to patrol North American waters. One such ship was the Gaspee. In June 1772, when the Gaspee ran aground, some 150 colonies seized and burned the ship. The British sent a commission to investigate and gave it the power to take suspects to Britain for trial. Colonists believed this violated their right to trial by a jury of their peers. After the Virginia House of Burgesses received a letter in March 1773 from Rhode Island asking for help, one of its members, Thomas Jefferson, suggested that each colony create a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other colonies about British activities. These committees of correspondence helped unify the colonies and shape public opinion. They also helped colonial leaders to coordinate plans. The Boston Tea Party. In May 1773, Britain's Parliament helped the British East India Company out of debt by passing the Tea Act of 1773. Prior to the Tea Act, colonial merchants had been smuggling in cheaper Dutch tea. As a result, the British East India Company had more than 70 million pounds of tea that it needed to sell quickly. The Tea Act reduced the tax on tea shipped to the colonies from the British East India Company, but maintained the townshend duty. This made more colonies willing to buy British tea, and smuggling decreased. The Tea Act enraged colonial merchants, who feared it was a step by the British to squeeze them out of business. It also angered colonies, who did not want to pay the tax. In October 1773, the East India Company shipped 1,253 chests of tea to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown. The committees of correspondence decided that the tea must not be unloaded. On December 16, 1773, the night before officials planned to bring the tea ashore, a group of about 150 men, dressed as Native Americans, in an attempt to mask their identities, secretly gathered at the Boston dock. One of the men was George Hewes, a struggling Boston shoemaker who had grown to despise the British. He gladly joined the other volunteers as they snuck aboard several ships anchored in Boston Harbor and destroyed the tea on board. Primary source: they divided us into three parties. For the purpose of boarding the three ships which contained the tea, we then were ordered by our own commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard. Quoted in the spirit of the 76, the story of the American Revolution as told by participants. Crowds on the shore cheered as the men dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. A witness later testified that Sam Adams and John Hancock were among those who boarded the ships. The raid later came to be called the Boston Tea Party. The Coercive Acts. The Boston Tea Party was the last straw for the British. In the spring of 1774, Parliament passed 4 new laws that came to be known as the Coercive Acts. These laws were intended to punish Massachusetts and put an end to colonial challenges to British authority. The first act was the Boston Port Act. It shut down Boston's port until the city paid for the tea that had been destroyed. The second act was the Massachusetts Government Act. It required all council members, judges, and sheriffs in Massachusetts to be appointed by the governor instead of being elected. Town meetings could only be held with governor's permission. The third act, the Administration of Justice Act, allowed the governor to transfer trials of British soldiers and officials to Britain to protect them from American juries. The final act was a new Quartering Act. It required local officials to provide lodging for British soldiers. To enforce the acts, the British sent more troops to New England and appointed General Thomas Gage, the governor of Massachusetts. In July 1774, a month after the last coercive act had become law, the British introduced the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act stated that a governor and council appointed by the king would run Quebec. It also extended Quebec's boundaries to include much of what is today Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin. If colonies moved west, they would live in territory where they had no elected assembly. The Coercive Act and Quebec Act together became known as the Intolerable Acts. The First Continental Congress. In May 1774, the Virginia House of Burgesses called for a day of fasting to protest the arrival of British troops in Boston. When Virginia's governor dissolved the House, the Burgesses went to a nearby tavern. In a resolution, they urged the colonies to suspend trade with Britain and to send delegates to a colonial congress to discuss more action. Similar appeals were made in New York and Rhode Island. On September 5, 1774, 55 colonial delegates met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. The delegates represented 12 of Britain's North American colonies. Florida, Georgia, Nova Scotia, and Quebec did not attend. Some delegates believed compromise with Britain was still possible. Others believed the time had come to fight. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which expressed loyalty to the king, but also condemned the coercive acts. Days later, the delegates approved a plan to form committees to enforce a boycott of British goods. The delegates agreed to hold a Second Continental Congress in May 1775 if the crisis had not been resolved. The revolution begins. In October 1774, members of the suspended Massachusetts Assembly defied the British and organized the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. They formed the Committee of Safety and chose John Hancock to lead it, giving him the power to call up the militia. A full-scale rebellion was now underway. Militias began to drill and practice shooting. The town of Concord created a special unit of men trained and ready to stand at a minute's warning in case of alarm. They became known as the Minutemen. Through the summer and fall of 1774, British control of the colonies, weakened as colonists, created provincial congresses, and militias raided military depots for ammunition. Loyalists and Patriots. Although many colonies did not agree with Parliament's policies, they were still loyal to the King and to Britain and believed that British law should be upheld. Americans who supported the British side in the conflict were known as Loyalists or Tories. Many Loyalists were government officials, Anglican ministers, or merchants and landowners. Some farmers remained loyal because they regarded the king as their protector against the merchants who controlled the local governments. Those who believed that the British had become tyrants were known as patriots or Whigs. Patriots were artisans, farmers, merchants, planters, lawyers, and urban workers. They were strong in New England and Virginia, while Loyalists lived in Georgia, the Carolinas, and New York. Patriot groups enforced the boycott of British goods, sometimes by tarring and feathering Loyalists. Loyalists fought back, but there were not as many as them, and they were not well organized. Lexington and Concord. In April 1775, the British government risked armed conflict by ordering General Gage to arrest the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Gage did not know where the Congress was sitting, so he decided to seize the militia supply depot at Concord instead. On April 18, about 700 British troops set out for Concord on a road that took them through the town of Lexington. Patriot leaders heard about the plan and sent Paul Revere and William Dawes to sound the alarm. The two men raced to Lexington and warned people that the British were coming. A third man, Dr. Samuel Prescott, joined them as they headed for Concord. A British patrol stopped Revere and Dawes, but Prescott got through in time to warn Concord. On April 19, British troops arrived in Lexington and spotted some 70 Minutemen lined up in the village green. The British marched onto the field and ordered them to disperse. The Minutemen had begun to back away when a shot was fired. No one is sure by whom. The British soldiers then fired at the Minutemen, killing 8 and wounding 10. The British then headed to Concord, where they found that most of the military supplies had been removed by the colonial militia. When they tried to cross the North Bridge on the far side of town, they ran into some 400 colonial militia. A fight broke out, forcing the British to retreat. As the British headed back to Boston, militia and farmers fired at them from behind trees, stone walls, barns, and houses. By the time the British reached Boston, 73 men had been killed, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing. The colonial forces had lost 49 men, 41 were wounded, and 5 were missing. News of the fighting spread across the colonies. Militia from all over New England raced to the area to help. By May 1775, the militia had surrounded Boston, trapping the British. The Second Continental Congress. 3 weeks later, after the battles at Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. The first issue was defense. The Congress voted to adopt the militia army surrounding Boston, and they named it the Continental Army. On June 15, 1775, the Congress elected George Washington to command the new army. Before Washington could get to his new command, the British landed reinforcements in Boston. Determined to gain control of the area, the British decided to seize the hills north of the city. Warned in advance, the militia acted first. On June 16, 1775, they dug in on Breed's Hill near Bunker Hill and began building a fort at the top. The following day, General Gage sent 2,200 troops to take the hill. According to legend, an American commander named William Prescott told his troops, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." When the British closed at 40 yards distance, the Americans fired. They stopped 2 British attacks and were forced to retreat only after running out of ammunition. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as it came to be called, helped build American confidence. It showed that the colonial militia could stand up to one of the world's most feared armies. The British suffered more than 1,000 casualties in fighting. Shortly after, General Gage resigned and was replaced by General William Howe. The situation became a stalemate with the British troops encircled by colonial militia. The decision to declare independence. Despite the onset of fighting, many colonies in the summer of 1775 were not prepared to break away from Great Britain. Most members of the Second Continental Congress wanted the right to govern themselves, but they did not want to break with the British Empire. By 1776, opinions had changed. Frustrated by the Britain's refusal to compromise, many patriot leaders began to call for independence. Efforts at peace. In July 1775, as the siege of Boston continued, the Continental Congress sent a document known as the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. Written primarily by John Dickinson, the petition stated that the colonies were still loyal to the king and asked him to call off hostilities until the situation could be negotiated peacefully. When the Olive Branch Petition arrived in London in August 1775, the king refused to look at it. Instead, he issued a proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition, declaring that the colonies were now in open and avowed rebellion. The proclamation called on all loyal British subjects in the colonies to bring the traitors to justice. When the Continental Congress authorized an attack on British troops based in Quebec, relations with the British were further strained. The delegates hoped the attack would convince the French in Quebec to rebel and join in fighting the British. The American forces captured the city of Montreal, but the French did not rebel. With no compromise with Britain likely, the Continental Congress began to act like an independent government. It sent people to negotiate with the Native Americans and establish a postal system, a Continental Navy, and a Marine Corps. By March 1776, the Continental Navy had raided the Bahamas and had begun seizing British merchant ships. The fighting spreads. As the revolution began, Governor Dunmore of Virginia organized two loyalist armies to assist British troops in Virginia, one composed of white loyalists, the other of enslaved Africans. Dunmore proclaimed that Africans enslaved by rebels would be freed if they fought for the Loyalists. The announcement convinced many Southern planters that the colonies had to declare independence. Otherwise, they might lose the enslaved labor their economy depended on. They increased their efforts to raise a large patriot army. In December 1775, the Patriot troops attacked and defeated Dunmore's forces near Norfolk, Virginia. Months later, the British pulled their soldiers out of Virginia, leaving the Patriots in control. In North Carolina, Patriot troops dispersed Loyalists at the Battle of Morse Creek Bridge in February 1776. The British then decided to seize Charlestown, South Carolina, but the city militia thwarted their attack. While fighting raged in the South, Washington ordered his troops to capture the hills south of Boston. After the Americans seized the hills by surprise and surrounded Boston, the British Navy evacuated the British troops, leaving the Patriots in control. Despite their defeats, it was clear that the British were not backing down. In December 1775, Parliament passed a Prohibitory Act, shutting down trade with the colonies and ordering a naval blockade. The British also began recruiting mercenaries or soldiers for hire from Germany. Common sense and independence. As the war dragged on, more and more patriots began to think that the time had come to declare independence. Although they feared that most colonies were still loyal to the king, in January 1776, public opinion began to change when Thomas Paine published a persuasive pamphlet called Common Sense. Until Common Sense appeared, nearly everyone viewed Parliament, not the king, as the enemy. In Common Sense, Paine attacked King George III. Parliament, he wrote, did nothing without the king's support. Paine argued that monarchies had been set up by seizing power from the people. King George III was a tyrant, and it was time for the colonies to declare independence. Primary source: everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, "'Tis time to part." Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom has been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long spelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. All receive the fugitive and prepare in time an asylum for mankind. From the Common Sense, 1776. Within 3 months, Common Sense had sold 100,000 copies. George Washington noted that common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of men. One by one, the provincial congresses and legislatures told their representatives at the Continental Congress to vote for independence. In early July, a committee submitted a document that Thomas Jefferson had drafted on independence. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress issued this Declaration of Independence. The colonies had now become the United States of America. The American Revolution had begun.